He didn't know who the boy was. He just saw him by the creek. His body dried out, dirt on his lips, eyes staring not at him, but through him. The cowboy got off his horse, filled his hat with water, and offered it. The boy drank like every swallow tore something inside him. He didn't ask where the child came from. He didn't take him to the authorities. He simply lifted him into the saddle and brought him home, fed him, gave him a blanket, let him stay. The next morning, the ground outside began to tremble. He stepped onto the porch. Standing in front of the ranch were riders. Perfect rows, absolute silence. 200 warriors, and each one stared at him like a man to whom they owed something. The sun hovered just above the western hills, spilling its last golden light across the dry plains like molten glass. The land shimmered in silence, save for the low rhythm of hooves against packed earth and the occasional creak of worn leather straps. He rode alone, the cowboy, with the kind of quiet that clings to men who have spent too long in their own company. His horse moved steadily beneath him, unhurried, guided more by instinct than rein. Dust lifted in thin streams behind them, curling upward into the cooling air and catching light like smoke from a dying fire. The path home was familiar, a series of small rises and dips that formed a winding trail through brittle grasses and long-forgotten fence lines. Here and there, the remnants of past ambitions lay scattered. A broken wheel, a collapsed post, the ghost of a structure that once dared to stand tall against the wind. He passed them without glancing. The land remembered better than he did. His eyes were tired but sharp, scanning the edges of the creek as it began to snake into view ahead. The water ran shallow in summer, a ribbon of silver too lazy to rush, its banks lined with scrub and the kind of green that fought hard to survive in a place that didn't want it. He wasn't looking for anything, not really, just letting his gaze drift in rhythm with the fading light. But something caught. It wasn't movement. It was the stillness, a shape too deliberate to be rock or branch. He slowed the horse with a shift of his weight and let it come to a stop without sound. There, in the shadow of a willow tree, curled tight into the base of its trunk, lay a figure, small, still. A child, he realized, though at first it was hard to tell. The body was too thin, the limbs too stiff. Dirt clung to the boy's skin like it had been there for weeks. His hair was matted, lips cracked, eyes half-lidded in a way that looked almost peaceful, except there was nothing peaceful about starvation. The cowboy dismounted slowly. His boots made soft impressions in the sandy bank, each step sending small ripples into the stillness of the moment. He approached with caution, not out of fear but out of respect. The kind of respect reserved for something sacred or broken. The boy didn't move. His chest rose and fell, but only just. His mouth hung slightly open, too dry to close fully. One hand rested across his stomach, the fingers clenched lightly, as if holding something that wasn't there anymore. There was no one else. No sound but the creak and the creak of saddle leather as the horse shifted its weight behind him. No footprints. No wagon tracks, no sign of pursuit or escape. It was as if the boy had been placed there by the land itself, a quiet offering to a world that had stopped listening. The cowboy crouched down beside him. The smell of sweat and dust and the faint copper tang of blood hung in the air. The boy's skin was warm, too warm, and dry as parchment. Fever. His legs were scratched and bruised, his bare feet blistered and torn. His clothing was little more than rags now, patches of cloth clinging to a body that had grown too light to hold them up. Still, the boy breathed. The cowboy reached into his canteen but thought better of it. Instead, he removed his hat, filled it at the creek, and brought it carefully to the child's lips. The water touched them gently, and at first nothing happened. Then the boy's tongue flicked out, hesitant, and he drank in small, jerking swallows, like his body couldn't decide if it remembered how. A line of water ran down his chin, soaked into the dirt on his neck. It was enough. The cowboy waited until the boy's breathing evened out again, then stood. He walked back to the horse, loosened the bedroll, shook it free, and returned to wrap the child gently. The blanket engulfed him, made him look smaller somehow, like a whisper folded in wool. He lifted the boy into his arms, careful not to jar the fragile limbs, and carried him to the horse. They moved slowly on the way back, the sun bleeding away behind them, casting long shadows that reached like fingers across the earth. The cowboy led the horse on foot, one hand on the reins, the other steadying the child where he lay slumped against the saddle horn, wrapped and silent. The boy's head bobbed slightly with each step, but he did not wake. The dog from the ranch met them halfway down the trail, ears low, tail still. It sniffed the air, circled once, then fell into step beside them, as if it too understood that this was not a night for barking. By the time they reached the house, the stars had begun to bloom across the sky, pale pinpricks scattered in an ocean of dark velvet. The house stood quiet, low-roofed and square, its windows dark. The windmill creaked softly in the distance, spinning just enough to remind them it was alive. Inside, the cowboy lit a lamp and moved through the space with quiet efficiency. He cleared the couch, spread a blanket, fetched a basin of water. He set the boy down gently, propped his head with a folded shirt, and covered him with another blanket. The dog settled near the door, eyes fixed on the child. He didn't ask himself why. The question never came. He just knew he wouldn't leave the boy out there. Not in that state. Not in that silence. The room filled with the scent of the oil lamp, of heat and cotton and dust. The cowboy sat across from the boy, watching, waiting. The child didn't wake, but his chest moved, slow and steady, and that was enough for now. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the grass, brushing against the walls, sighing through the cracks in the shutters like a voice that had waited a long time to be heard. The morning unfolded without fanfare, slipping in through the gaps in the shutters like a quiet visitor too polite to knock. The wind had died down sometime before dawn, leaving behind a stillness that settled over the ranch like dust, fine and unshakable. The dog stirred first, lifting its head from the floor and sniffing the air, then rose and stretched, nails clicking lightly against the wooden planks as it padded across the room. The cowboy was already awake, sitting at the edge of the table with his back to the door, nursing a cup of bitter coffee that had long since gone cold. The mug sat in his hand more out of habit than need, a weight to keep his fingers busy while his thoughts wandered. The boy hadn't moved. He lay on the couch where he'd been placed the night before, wrapped in layers too heavy for the warmth of early summer. His chest rose and fell, steady but shallow, like breath was something he hadn't yet fully earned back. The cowboy had checked on him once during the night, pulling the blanket higher when the air turned sharp. He hadn't spoken, hadn't touched more than necessary, but he'd stayed within reach, just in case. Sunlight crept farther into the room, painting everything in a pale gold that softened the hard lines of the furniture and brought out the scars in the wooden floor. The boy stirred beneath the covers, a hand twitching, a leg shifting slightly under the fabric. His face remained turned toward the wall, his brow furrowed, mouth parted in restless sleep. Whatever dreams claimed him were not kind. The cowboy rose slowly, joints cracking in protest, and crossed to the basin. He poured fresh water into the kettle and set it on the stove without sound. Each movement was careful, measured, as if the house itself might shatter under too much sudden noise. The stillness was sacred now, a delicate glass bell balanced between breath and silence. He glanced once more at the boy, then turned his attention to the fire. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning the mist off the grass and casting long shadows beneath the fence posts. Birds began to call from the trees beyond the pasture, and the distant lowing of cattle gave the land a rhythm again. The ranch, for all its quiet, had begun to stir. The boy opened his eyes sometime mid-morning. Not all at once. First one, then the other, each blink slow and uncertain as though returning from a place far away and half-remembered. He didn't sit up. His body remained still beneath the blanket, but his gaze moved, scanning the ceiling, the walls, the unfamiliar world that now held him. He didn't look for anyone. He didn't call out. He simply watched. The cowboy kept his distance. He placed a bowl of warm broth on the table near the couch and stepped away, sitting again in his usual place by the door. He didn't speak. There was no need. Words would come when they were ready or not at all. For now, presence was enough. Eventually, the boy sat up, slow and cautious, his small hands pushing against the cushion as if unsure of their strength. The blanket fell to his waist, revealing the sharp lines of his collarbones, the thinness of his arms. He reached for the bowl with trembling fingers and lifted it to his lips without spilling a drop. The cowboy watched, not staring, but observing with the kind of quiet attention that spoke of respect, not curiosity. They spent the day that way. The boy remained in the room, rising only to use the wash basin or stand at the window where he peered out at the dry earth and distant sky with a look that was part longing, part disbelief. He said nothing, ate little, drank slowly. But each hour that passed without him collapsing or retreating into the fevered haze of the night before felt like a small victory. A breath reclaimed. As evening approached, the cowboy fetched a clean shirt from the chest and laid it near the foot of the couch. It was too large, sleeves hanging well past the boy's wrists, but the gesture was understood. The child took it without comment, slipping it over his thin shoulders, letting it swallow him whole. He sat back down on the couch, hands folded in his lap, eyes now tracking the shifting light across the floorboards. He seemed calmer then, less guarded. Not at ease, but not ready to run either. The cowboy lit the lamp as the sun slipped behind the hills, its glow soft and amber in the fading light. The dog curled at the boy's feet, tail thumping once before settling still. The house exhaled in the quiet that followed. A long breath released after a day held in tension. That night, the boy didn't lie curled into himself as before. He stretched out, not fully, but enough to suggest that whatever had haunted his sleep before had loosened its grip. The blanket still wrapped around him, but not like armor. More like comfort. More like choice. The cowboy sat for a long time by the window, listening to the wind return in slow, steady pulses. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched as the stars appeared, one by one, each a silent witness to a moment too fragile to break with words. In the stillness of that room, between breath and silence, something old began to dissolve and something new took root. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition. And that for now was enough. The morning rose pale and slow over the land, its light diffused through thin clouds that stretched across the horizon like worn cotton. There was a peculiar stillness to it, not the peace of a quiet day, but the kind of silence that precedes something unspoken. The cowboy stood on the porch with a mug in one hand and the weight of habit in the other, staring out toward the eastern ridge where the line of the land folded gently into itself. The dog lay at his feet, unmoving, ears twitching every so often toward sounds he alone seemed to hear. Behind them, the house was warm with the scent of coffee and faint wood smoke. Inside, the boy still slept, or at least rested with eyes closed, his breaths even but light, like he feared waking too fully in case it was a mistake. The air carried a faint vibration that morning. It wasn't sound, exactly, but something deeper, something that moved through the ground and settled in the bones before it could be named. The cowboy felt it beneath his boots. A low hum that reminded him of distant thunder or the slow approach of cattle over dry earth. He squinted into the distance, watching the ridgeline as though it might unfold and reveal whatever it was that caused the uneasy stir in the soil. But there was nothing yet. Just open plains and the glint of light on heat-shimmering brush. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and moved to the barn. The morning chores were routine. Feeding the animals, checking the water barrels, replacing the broken latch on the rear gate. But everything felt strangely subdued. The chickens were restless, pacing more than usual. The horse shifted in his stall, breathing heavy, snorting at the wind. Even the air inside the barn held a tightness, like it had been holding a breath all night long. By mid-morning, the boy had woken and taken his seat near the window, wrapped in the same oversized shirt, his eyes following the light as it crept along the floorboards. He didn't speak, but he watched the cowboy's every move with quiet intensity. He seemed more present, less guarded. The lines in his brow had softened. His body sat more upright. There was something in his gaze that hinted at returning awareness, as if the fog of fever had finally begun to lift and left behind the tentative beginnings of curiosity. It was then that the sound came. At first it was faint, like the roll of distant wheels on hard-packed ground. Then it deepened, growing fuller, heavier, resonant with purpose. The dog sat up, ears fully erect now, body tense and pointed toward the front of the house. The cowboy paused at the trough, hand still resting on the handle of the pump. His eyes narrowed, and he turned his head slowly, tracking the source of the approaching thunder. The earth vibrated again, more pronounced now. Dust rose in the distance, forming a low cloud that crept toward the ranch like a living thing. Shapes emerged within it. Figures mounted on horseback, rows of them, disciplined and silent. No banners, no sound of voice or gun. Just the steady beat of hooves in perfect rhythm, the ground rolling with the cadence of their approach. 200, maybe more. They did not gallop. They did not charge. They came at a measured pace, slow enough to see, fast enough to arrive all at once. The boy stood from his place at the window, his face frozen, one hand braced on the glass. His breath caught in his throat, and his shoulders stiffened. The cowboy stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door ease shut behind him without a sound. He did not reach for a rifle, did not speak. He simply watched as the riders drew closer and came to a stop in neat, unwavering rows at the edge of the field. The air stilled completely, the wind suspended, the birds gone silent. The only sound now was the soft clink of harnesses and the breathing of horses. At the center of the formation sat a rider dressed in crimson cloth and aged leather, adorned not with medals but with signs of rank older than any uniform. Feathers hung from his shoulders, his braids bound with colored beads, and his gaze was calm, fixed, unreadable. He held no weapon. None of them did. They did not move. Not a single hand shifted. They simply waited, their presence as quiet as it was overwhelming. The boy stepped outside without the cowboy noticing, his bare feet padding lightly across the wood until he stood just behind the man who had brought him home. He stared at the riders, eyes wide, mouth barely parted. Something in him recognized them, though he had never seen most of their faces. He knew the language of their silence. He knew the history woven into the way they stood, the reverence in their stillness, the message in their arrival. The cowboy did not turn around. He didn't need to. He felt the shift behind him, the presence of the child now standing tall despite his thin frame, the weight of something sacred anchoring the space between them and the visitors across the field. Then, one by one, the riders began to nod. Not a bow, not a salute, just a simple nod, acknowledgement, gratitude, a gesture older than the flags of any nation. The leader nodded last, slow and deep, and held the motion just long enough for it to land like a stone dropped into still water. Then, in perfect coordination, they turned their horses and began to leave, not in haste, but in silent procession. The dust rose again behind them, softer now, trailing off into the horizon like the smoke of a fire that had already burned and passed. The cowboy stood still until the last of them disappeared into the shimmering light, and only the hush of wind through grass remained. When he finally turned around, the boy was looking up at him, his eyes filled with something too large for words, and the ranch, for the first time in a long while, felt full. The land returned to silence after the riders vanished, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the hush of something sacred having passed through and left an invisible mark. The fields no longer felt lonely. The porch no longer echoed with absence. Even the shadows seemed less heavy, as if the weight of solitude had lifted just slightly, replaced by something deeper, something unspoken that clung to the ranch like morning mist. The boy moved through the house differently now. He no longer kept close to the walls or ducked his head when someone passed. His steps, though light, no longer whispered apologies into the floorboards. He sat straighter at the table, held his cup with both hands, and drank without flinching when the wood creaked or the wind rattled the shutters. The cowboy noticed the changes, but he didn't name them. He simply adjusted. He left the door open more often. He cooked enough for two without making a point of it. He began leaving the saddle on the second horse, just in case. The boy started helping with the chores not because he was asked, but because he began to feel the rhythm of the place and wanted to match it. He filled water buckets and carried kindling. He opened the chicken coop in the mornings and scattered feed in careful arcs, watching how the hens flurried and settled again. He followed the cowboy to the barn and stood in silence while tools were repaired, ropes mended, and grain sorted into neat burlap sacks. He didn't speak much, but his silence no longer held fear. It held attention. Some days the boy sat on the fence and watched the sky for hours, eyes fixed on some invisible point far beyond the hills. Other days he walked the edge of the pasture barefoot, dragging his fingers through tall grass, head bowed, lips moving without sound. He often paused near the creek where he had been found, standing motionless for long stretches, as if the stones might whisper back to him if he just listened long enough. The cowboy gave him space to do it. Healing wasn't something you demanded. It was something you waited for. The nights grew cooler as summer edged toward fall. The evenings arrived earlier, cloaking the house in orange light and long shadows. The boy began lighting the lamps without being told. He watched the flames catch and rise, his expression distant, like fire spoke a language he was only now remembering. Once, he lit a candle and let it burn all the way down without moving from his place beside it. His eyes fixed on the slow descent of wax and the quiet patience of flame. There were questions that went unasked. The cowboy knew better than to pry. Some truths were too tangled to unravel in words. He saw the way the boy's hands trembled when he heard distant gunfire, even if it was just hunters beyond the ridge. He saw the way his eyes darkened whenever certain names were mentioned in town, or when someone looked too long in their direction. The people of the town had begun to whisper less. The sight of the boy riding beside the cowboy into the general store had shifted something in their expressions. No longer surprise, but wary acceptance. No one asked where the boy came from. No one dared, not after the story of the warriors had spread like dust on wind. Folks had seen the dust cloud. They had counted the riders. They had heard the quiet of it, the lack of weapons, the overwhelming weight of their presence. And they had chosen, collectively, to let the matter rest. One afternoon, the boy followed the cowboy out to the field beyond the barn. The fence there was falling down, its posts split and leaning. The wire rusted and slack. Together they began the work of rebuilding it. They didn't speak, but their movements mirrored one another. The cowboy dug the holes. The boy held the posts steady. He hammered with unsure hands at first, then with growing strength. The sound of metal on wood rang through the valley, sharp and clean, like punctuation against the quiet. Sweat gathered on the boy's brow and dirt clung to his arms, but he didn't stop. He worked until the sun sank low, until the fence stood upright in a new straight line across the edge of the field. That night they sat on the porch side by side, watching the horizon melt into shadow. The stars came out one by one, flickering to life as the last warmth left the earth. The boy leaned back against the post, arms crossed over his chest, breathing steady. The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of cloth, faded red, worn at the edges, embroidered with a pattern so old it felt like a story. He handed it to the boy without a word. The boy unfolded it carefully, ran his fingers across the threads, then held it in both hands for a long time. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. Some gifts were explanations in themselves. The dog rested at their feet, tail thumping once, then settling. The wind stirred the grass, and the porch creaked under their weight. There was no sound from the house, no lantern burning behind them. Just the open air, the dark, and the quiet understanding between two souls who had survived things they couldn't describe, now learning, slowly, how to live again. In the darkness, the boy tilted his head back and looked at the stars, not with longing, but with presence. He was here now. He had been seen. And though his past still lingered somewhere out there in the deep black beyond the ridges, it no longer held all the power. Something had shifted. Something had rooted. And though the world remained vast and often cruel, for now this corner of it was still and warm and his. The first frost came quietly, like a breath held too long. It crept across the window panes during the night and traced delicate white veins along the edges of the glass. The grass outside bent beneath its weight, silver and still in the pale morning light. The boy was the first to see it. He stood barefoot by the window, one hand pressed against the cool pane, eyes scanning the pasture as if the season's shift had stirred something deeper inside him. Behind him, the house was quiet. The fire had burned low. The air held that sharp edge that comes not with wind but with the absence of warmth. The cowboy was already outside, steam rising from the horses as he brushed them down, breath clouding in front of him in slow, measured bursts. His coat was buttoned high, hat pulled low. The dog padded along behind him, leaving paw prints in the frost that melted only seconds after his passing. There was no hurry in his movements. Cold mornings never invited speed. They demanded patience, letting the body remember how to bend, how to bear the chill, how to greet the day without defiance. The boy dressed in layers, wrapping himself in the same red-patterned cloth the cowboy had given him weeks ago. It no longer hung from his shoulders like borrowed fabric. It had softened, taken on the scent of smoke and earth, molded to his frame like something earned. He stepped outside and joined the cowboy in the yard, silent as always, but no longer hesitant. He moved with purpose, picked up the feed pail without instruction, and began his work. There was routine now, but not repetition. Each day came with its own rhythm, and the boy learned to listen for it. The frost meant the ground was harder, the tools colder, the animals quieter. The sky seemed farther away on mornings like this, like the cold had stretched it taut above their heads. But the boy didn't mind. He had grown into the quiet. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a place he belonged. He helped mend the roof of the chicken coop that day. The wind had torn part of it loose during the last storm, and now the boards hung awkwardly at the edge, clapping against the frame with each gust. The cowboy steadied the ladder while the boy climbed. Hammer and nails tucked into the pocket of his coat. His fingers were clumsy in the cold, but he didn't stop. He drove each nail with the careful focus of someone who had once been invisible and now wanted to leave a mark. The wind bit at his cheeks, turned his knuckles red, but he stayed until the final board was secured. In town, word had spread beyond whispers. The ranch had become something of a quiet legend. People still didn't speak the boy's name, many had never learned it, but they watched. They noticed. They saw him riding beside the cowboy now, seated tall in the saddle, eyes alert. They saw the way he nodded at shopkeepers, the way he moved through the market without fear. And they saw the way others stepped aside, not out of disdain, but respect. Not for what he had done, but for what had been done for him. One evening, the boy found the cowboy sitting in the barn, sharpening a rusted old blade he'd never used in the boy's presence. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, more tool than threat, but something about the quiet precision of it gave the moment weight. The boy didn't interrupt. He sat nearby, back against a bale of hay, and watched the light glint off the steel with each stroke. The silence between them was not awkward. It had the density of shared memory. They didn't need to speak to know what they were thinking. Winter was coming fast, and with it, change. Later that night, the boy stepped out alone into the field. The moon was high and full, casting silver across the dry ground. He stood beneath its light, wrapped in his red cloth, shoulders squared. His breath rose like smoke, but he didn't shiver. He looked toward the hills, not searching, not waiting, but remembering. The wind whispered through the grass, brushing past his legs like something familiar. He closed his eyes and listened, not for voices, but for belonging. And in that stillness under that sky, he felt it. When he returned to the house, the cowboy had left a small bundle at the foot of his bed, new gloves, thick and rough, with hand-stitched edges and patches sewn from worn denim. They weren't perfect. They weren't pretty. But they were made to last. The boy picked them up and slipped them on. They were too big. They'd need time to fit him right. But he smiled just faintly and kept them on through the night. And so, the days continued, one folding quietly into the next. The boy's body grew stronger. His eyes steadier. His silences no longer felt like walls but like doors, slowly opening. He began to whistle, low and tuneless, while sweeping the porch. He started humming when cleaning tack, not melodies he knew, but sounds born of movement and comfort. He glanced toward the cowboy now and then, a flicker of acknowledgement in his gaze, and sometimes, in return, the cowboy would tip his hat just slightly, nothing grand, just enough to say, "I see you." Winter pressed closer. The light thinned. The shadows grew longer. But inside the house, the fire burned steady, and in the boy's eyes, something long lost had begun to flicker back to life. Not safety. Not yet. But maybe something even rarer. Hope. The snow came in the night. No warning. No wind. Just a quiet, persistent fall that blanketed the earth while the world slept. By dawn, the landscape had been transformed into a field of white, stretching from the edge of the barn to the distant tree line like a sheet pulled smooth over old scars. The boy stood at the window for a long time, his breath fogging the glass as he watched it all disappear, the dry tracks in the dirt, the wooden fence posts, the yellowed grass that used to ripple in the wind. It was all gone now, buried under something soft and cold and silent. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just stared as if trying to decide whether the snow was a beginning or an end. The cowboy had already lit the fire in the kitchen stove and was melting water in a kettle that steamed slow and steady. The dog lay curled by the hearth, content and still, a patch of warmth in a room that smelled faintly of ash and pine. The boy moved toward the coat rack and dressed without a word, pulling on layers, fitting his hands into the gloves he'd grown into, wrapping the red cloth around his neck with the same motion he used every morning now. He met the cowboy outside by the barn, the cold cutting into his lungs, the snow crunching beneath his boots like a memory. They worked together in silence, digging paths through the drifts, clearing space for the animals, breaking ice at the troughs. The sky above was pale and soundless, the sun a dim smudge trying to burn through the haze. Each movement required effort, but neither of them complained. The labor had become ritual, a way of anchoring themselves to something steady when the world kept shifting beneath their feet. The boy no longer hesitated before taking a task. He knew what needed doing and did it. The animals trusted him now. Even the horse, once wary, let him stroke its muzzle and brush its coat without a twitch. Inside the house, the cold found its way into the corners. They kept the fire going, fed it every few hours, watched the flame curl around the logs like it was hungry for movement. The boy sat by the hearth some evenings, not reading, not sleeping, just watching. He would take the blade the cowboy had given him, dull-edged and meant for training, and run a cloth across it again and again, not to sharpen it, but to learn its weight. He studied its curve, its balance, how the light touched the metal and ran like water along the spine. Days passed. The snow deepened. Roads became impassable. Mail stopped coming. The town was quieter now, too far for casual visits. They were alone in the hills, just the two of them, the house, the fire, and the snow. And for the first time, the boy didn't seem afraid of the isolation. He no longer scanned the horizon for escape. He no longer woke in the middle of the night gasping for air. He slept through until morning. He breathed slow and deep. The nightmares, when they came, did not pull him from sleep screaming, but with a sigh, a tremble, the kind of pain that was fading but not yet gone. Then one morning the dog barked. Once, low, alert. The cowboy stood from the table, fork still in hand, and walked to the window. The boy joined him, his shadow moving across the floor as snowlight poured in. Down the road, a rider approached, alone, wrapped in a dark coat, moving with purpose. They waited on the porch, watching the figure grow larger. The snow was too thick for speed, but the horse moved steadily, carving a path with each slow step. When the rider arrived, he said nothing, just handed the cowboy a folded letter and nodded once. The cowboy opened it, eyes scanning the page, face unreadable. The rider turned without waiting for a response and rode away, disappearing into the white just as silently as he had come. Inside, the cowboy set the letter on the table. The boy looked at it, then at the man. There was something in the cowboy's posture. Still, square, but softer than usual. An old wound shifting beneath a fresh coat. He told the boy with a glance that things might change soon. That something was calling him back into a world he'd left behind. But he also told him, wordlessly, that he wasn't going alone. The next few days were spent preparing. The horses were fed more, trained in the deeper snow. Supplies were packed, saddlebags with food, blankets, tools. The boy didn't ask where they were going. He just helped. He rolled the bedrolls tight. He checked the canteens. He patched the worn edges of their coats with careful stitching. He was ready. Whatever waited out there in the snow-covered world, he would meet it now with eyes open and shoulders square. On the final evening, before they were to leave, the cowboy took the boy out to the edge of the ridge. The moon lit the snow like silver glass. Below them, the valley stretched wide and still. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. Then the cowboy reached into his coat and handed the boy a small, wrapped object. Inside was a feather. Long, dark, perfect. The boy held it in both hands and stared at it until the cold numbed his fingers. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, solemn and sure. They returned to the house and slept with their boots beside the bed. In the morning, they rode out, man and boy, horse and trail. The snow swallowed the sound of their passage. Behind them, the ranch stood silent, smoke curling from the chimney, the fire still burning. Ahead, the world waited, not with promises, not with answers, but with open space and the faintest warmth of the sun cutting through the cold. And for the first time, the boy didn't look back.